Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Anne-Marie Slaughter discussing her new book, Renewal, From Crisis to Transformation in Our Lives, Work, and Politics. She is joined tonight in conversation by Fatema Sumar. Through good times and bad, Harvard Bookstore will continue to bring authors and their work to our virtual community. Our fall season is ramping up, and boy, do we have a lineup for you. Make sure to check out our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Renewal, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Without your continued support and patronage, this virtual author series wouldn't be possible. Thank you again for tuning in support of our authors, our incredible booksellers, and our landmark independent bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now I am so excited to introduce tonight's speakers. Anne-Marie Slaughter is CEO of New America. She is Professor Emerita of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. From 2009 to 2011, she served as Director of Policy Planning for the United States Department of State, the first woman to hold that position. Anne-Marie has written or edited 8 books, written over 100 scholarly articles, and is a contributing editor to the Financial Times. She is joined tonight by Fatema Sumar. Fatema is the Vice President of Compact Operations at the U.S. Millennium Challenge Corporation, where she leads efforts to fight poverty by transforming global systems in reaching vulnerable populations. She previously worked as Vice President of Global Programs at Oxfam America. In Congress, she was a senior professional staff member on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, focused on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the broader region. Her new book, Bureaucracies to End Poverty, comes out this fall. Tonight, they're discussing renewal. Like much of the world, America is deeply divided over identity, equality, and history. Renewal is Anne-Marie's candid and deeply personal account of how her own odyssey opened the door to an important new understanding of how we as individuals, organizations, and nations can move backward and forward at the same time, facing the past and embracing a new future. Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn, said about it, "Renewal offers a way forward that combines necessary historical reckoning with hope, pride, and an inspiring version of a fairer and more productive America. It's also a powerful story of leadership and transformation with lessons for making significant positive impact in this world." And on that note of high praise, I'll turn things over to our speakers. Anne-Marie, Fatema, thank you so much for joining me. The virtual stage is yours.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. Audrey, thank you so much for that generous welcome. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. Thank you for taking time out of your schedules, out of your lives, to join Anne-Marie Slaughter for her new book, Renewal. Anne-Marie, it's really great to see you. Thank you for letting me be part of this really important discussion that I think is taking place at such an important time in our nation's history today. And I know over the next hour, we're gonna cover everything, and we're gonna talk about both the personal, the collective, and really what this book can mean for each of us in a very, very deeply personal way. And that's how I read it, in this very deeply personal way. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, Anne-Marie, is you actually started out chapter 8, your first sentence in chapter 8 said, quote, "Big ideas excite me. They actually make my heart race." I thought that was a perfect quote to start tonight off with. Tell us a little bit about your journey to write this book. Tell us about your big idea. Why is your heart racing even as we're having this conversation? And how do you get here? You've written so many books. You're so accomplished in so many ways. How did you get to Renewal?
Well, Fatema, thank you. And I have to start just by saying how pleased I am to be able to do this with you. You are a former student and friend and colleague, and it's lovely to be able to have this conversation with you. And it's particularly nice for me to be back at the Harvard bookstore, even if only virtually. I moved to Cambridge in 1982 and lived there for all but 4 years until 2002. And I spent many happy hours in the Harvard bookstore. So I'd love to be there in person, and I can visualize it, but at least we will do it virtually. And it's a great first conversation to have about renewal. It's funny that you choose that quote, because today is my first day back in the office at New America, and I've had many conversations with really big ideas about the future of our economy, about how we think about equity. This book started really with the idea of renewal as not just a word that we all think we know. We use it in everything from meditation to thinking about many different processes. But for me, I looked at it, and through my own experience, have come to understand it as this process that like the word itself, looks backwards and forwards at the same time. So you can say renewal, renewal. The looking backward is essential as your first step. And looking backward with what I call radical honesty. Enough honesty to be able to encounter a reckoning, repair, but really unsparing acceptance of your past. And then there's a looking forward with enough hope and confidence to be able to build something really new. And the two things, and this is really where it does come down to my own experience, which I offer as an analogy. I don't think I represent the nation, but where my own experience was one where this looking backward and having the confidence to look backward and to be honest gave me then the strength and the ability and the hope to be able to really transform, to build something new in my own life. And that's a process that I think can be helpful to any individual, to any organization, and I lead an organization. And I very much hope to our country as a whole, as we need to, I think, renew the promise of the country and to build something new.
So, what really struck me, Anne-Marie, when I read it, and your introduction in particular, so you really, and without even going into the details of what the crisis was, because it doesn't matter, we all face crises in whatever organization, in our families, in our professional lives, but you use that crisis to not just figure out how to save your job, so to speak, but to really think and push yourself around what kind of leader you are and what kind of leader you want to be. As you take us from the introduction in the book throughout the journey that starts personal, but leads us to this really important sense of collective, why is it so important for each of us to go through that journey for ourselves, to really ask ourselves these types of questions if we want to have collective impact? So a lot of us, we go to schools, whatever our field of profession is, we could be in law and business and policy. And we think, we go to school, we get the degrees, we join the firm, so to speak, whatever the firm represents, and we do our jobs. When I read your book, you're making me question that that's not good enough. That model's not good enough, that I have to do some more personal work in order to have the kind of impact at the collective level. Why is that so important? And why do you start out that book in the first few chapters really sharing so much of your own individual journey?
Well, so I wanted to tell my own story, in part, honestly, to invite people to share it, to not write another policy book about what we as a country should do, but to invite people in and to open the door in a way that, yes, is definitely vulnerable, but I also think many people will resonate with some version of a crisis they've had. But I also wanted to tell that story because of the lesson that one of my board members taught me. And I describe, going through this crisis, calling my mentor and friend, and he said, run toward the criticism. And it's David Bradley, who is the head of Atlantic Media, and he's very funny. And he said, you're having an argument with your spouse, and it's clear that you're 98% right, and your spouse is at best 2% right. And he said, run toward that 2%, run toward the criticism, which I did. And I tell the story of calling other board members, going back, talking to other people earlier in my life, the president of Princeton, as an example, to actually seek out criticism and face it and look for a pattern. And that only in doing that could I really see myself enough in the round to be then able to change, to basically batter down my own defenses, because we all have defenses. And, I'm not certain everybody needs to do that in the same exact way that I did. And I think there are plenty of people in the society who need building up. And so I'm not suggesting that that everyone needs to subject themselves to brutal self-examination. I do think that many of us in the United States, particularly white Americans, particularly affluent Americans, are being challenged at the moment and being told you do need to do work. Your narrative of yourself and your country, and often your organization, while full of good intentions, is not how we experience it. So I do think that for many of us, really being willing to accept the idea that maybe other people don't see us the way we see ourselves, and maybe our organizations look different, and maybe our country looks different. It's a hard process. It is work. And I wanted to really model that in the book, to say, yeah, this is what it takes. And I'm willing to show you what I had to go through, because I think for many of us, we're going to have to do that kind of radically honest work.
And just a note for our audience listening in as we're speaking right now, please put your own questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and in about 20 minutes or so, we'll definitely try to turn to the chat and make sure that we can also answer your questions as well. So Anne-Marie, when you talk about, there's 4 themes that jumped out at me when I read this, right? And it's really how you structure the book in many ways around lessons and around resilience, risk, leadership, and power. So your first couple of chapters 1 and 2, really talk about resilience, this first theme. And you talked about some of that, running towards the criticism, this very, I thought, powerful narrative between you and Shirley Tillman, of the former president of Princeton, where you ask her flat out why you're not interim dean when there is a leadership transition, and she's brutally honest with you about why you're not, and you have to really hear that and understand that and the implications of that perhaps are beyond Princeton, right? And apply to other facets of leadership. As you're thinking about resilience and connecting to change, part of your experience for me resonated as something around leadership and what leaders need to do around accountability, around resilience. So whereas I think you're right in saying that you're certainly not subjecting everyone to have to go through this process. I do wonder, though, if you are saying, do we need more leaders in our society, whether that's in the nonprofit space, in government, in the private sector, civil society? Do our leaders need to hold themselves to more greater account? Because you can't get to shared power, as you talk about later, without that accountability. So how do you think about what leaders at the leadership level? You're certainly one of them, but what would you say to other leaders, either in your space or in other sectors around that journey?
I do think that leaders of private sector, nonprofit leaders, government leaders right now do have a special responsibility. Part of that is also a huge generational change. I'm a baby boomer. You're probably Gen X, or maybe are you a millennial?
I'm on the cusp, you know. I'm
You're
like,
on the cusp, but certainly, you know, I lead an organization that is mostly millennials and now Gen Z, and the younger generation are demanding transformation, whether that is to leave them a better earth. And in so many ways, if we think about climate change, or a more equal and just society. And again, particularly those of us of a certain age, you think that your views are owed some amount of deference because you're older and because you're in this position of authority. And as a leader, you do have to exercise authority. There's no, it can't be a group grope all the time. You can't lead by consensus. But at this moment of transition, or this real inflection point for our society, I do think we have to be able to hear and see differently. And again, the best way to do that is to challenge your own narrative of yourself. And as I say, it's easier to see when we talk about the country, when we say, you know, this country is going to be a plurality country. It's not going to have a white majority. We're going to, you know, we will be different. We have to hear many different stories about our history, many of them ones that certainly people like me, again, sort of white, affluent people, never wanted to hear these stories, never heard them before. So this process of really looking yourself in the mirror and trying to see differently and trying to hear what others think, I think is an extraordinarily useful exercise. And it ties to resilience because I've come to understand resilience as not just endurance. And we've just been through these hurricanes, you know, the kind of hunkering down and weathering the whatever comes, but actually as a process of transformation and a process of adaptation. And that you are much more resilient with others, but to be with others, and particularly to lead with others, even if you're ultimately at the top of the org chart, I think you have to lead much more collaboratively. That again requires that you can hear other people and really hear what they're trying to say, and often voice it when they don't dare, when they're trying to tell you that you've made a mistake. You need to be able to hear that and say, you know, I think what you're really saying is that I was wrong. Or I think what you're really saying is I've had a pattern of X. And again, it's not all about you, but that I do think that's an important attribute for a leader.
and certainly, you know, we all work, I'm sure many of us work in organizations where you do 360 reviews, right? Where,
yes.
and not just your bosses, but subordinates and colleagues at equal levels. But it's different to take the input, hear it, I think is what you're trying to say. And it was interesting how you shared very openly with us your journey to actually hear it, hear the worst. And I'm sure in many ways, I can imagine if I were in your shoes, it could be very sobering, like it could be for any of us. If someone said to me, Fatema, da 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 da, nodding my head, which is what I'm doing right now, and really sitting with it and grappling with it. I think that's when I read that part of it, Anne-Marie, what I thought a lot about is we're in this moment in our country where there's so many problems. You can pick your problem of what what moves you and what you're passionate about, but there's this feeling that it's somebody else's problem to fix, and the fault is, you know, this way, it's over there. And it's hard to move ourselves collectively as a nation to starting with us as one of the first parts of that, of to say, where do I fit into it? And it may not be my fault, but where do I fit into that journey, so to speak? And I think that's something that also struck me in the way that you're writing, which leads into the next section around, you talk a lot about risk. And you say in chapter 3, which is all about rethinking risk, and you give many examples of that, but you say the face of risk-taking in the US is male, largely white, and flashy. Risk-taking requires security. And you go on to give examples of what in our history, what that safety and security has looked like for certain populations. You reference the New Deal, other social safety nets, increasingly the care economy, something a lot of us are talking about. But you also address and talk about how that the security is not always evenly spread or evenly felt. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your thinking around what it takes for us to be able to lean in and accept risk and not for it to just be something that only some of us can afford.
Well, that white male flashy vision of risk, think of risky business. That is what so many of us think of, you know, the Tom Cruise idea, or later Top Gun, or so many of these both movies and stories of venture capitalists or startup founders rather, who go out and, you know, max out their credit cards and put everything on the line, and their startup finally takes off. And I always told a story about taking risks in my own life, of going to law school and thinking I was going to go to a law firm, and then deciding I didn't want to go to a law firm, and just kind of hanging out, frankly, at Harvard Law School for a couple of years till I could figure out what I was going to do. Those things felt risky, but if you really look at it, I could take those risks because I wasn't going to fall very far. Right. The worst thing that's going to happen to me is I'm going to go back home to my parents in Virginia and regroup with a fancy degree. And, you know, it's a risk in my social circles. It felt risky when your parents don't approve. But actually, what we know is that risk taking is a calculation of costs and benefits. There are certainly people who are more likely to say, I'm going to go for the benefits, even at a high cost. So there are personality differences, but the research on risk shows that there is no one type, right? And it's definitely not gendered. Women take just as many risks as men. In fact, they take more social risks than men do, but we take them in different ways, and we all make those calculations. So what that means, and again, take the example of the startup founder. Generally, it's a pretty affluent kid who has dropped out of college or left right after college, but gone to California or New York, still on their parents' health insurance. So they're not risking losing health insurance. And then typically they have what's called a friends and family round of fundraising, which tells you right away that their friends and families can at least give them enough to get to $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 to get them going. That again tells you they have a baseline level of security. If taking a risk means you're going to end up on the street, you're going to lose your house, you're going to lose your health insurance, you don't take risks. And again, the research on this is very clear. Poor cultures are not risk-taking cultures because they can lose everything. So where you come out then is that the paradox is, if you want entrepreneurial, innovative, risk-taking people, you have got to give them a baseline below which, or a foundation below which, they're not going to fall, which is not the way the United States thinks about breeding that kind of entrepreneurial, innovative, daring behavior that many of us want.
And I mean, I think for so many people, where this even talking about this can make them feel really uncomfortable, right? In some ways, because they may not even feel that there's no runway for them to consider.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? You write about that in the book. You talk about for some people, this you can afford to take a lot of risk, and for others, it literally is having a roof over your head or not, and what that means. And you know, what got me thinking is, in today's challenge, and as we think more about the collective here of where we are today with COVID, climate, and everything else we're dealing with in this country right now, if we don't create more spaces and more social safety nets for everybody to be able to lean in, to be able to even have that same opportunity, it becomes very hard to create that ecosystem of which you talk about, which in many ways is what has made us such a great nation, right? For of years. So that gets us to leadership, and really transition for particularly, you talk a lot about leadership, and I wanted to probe a little bit more because you used terminology that was even different for me, which that doesn't say very much, but you talk a lot about these differences between horizontal and vertical leadership, and you use these stories throughout the book, but particularly in chapter 4 around colleagues of yours at New America that have really changed you and shaped the way you think about leadership. And you mentioned Tyra Mariani's, you can correct me if I'm saying it wrong, I apologize, and Cecilia Munoz is named. Can you talk to us a little bit about, you write this, I was lecturing on horizontal leadership, practicing vertical leadership.
This is the slightly wonkier part of the book. I have written about networks for over almost 30 years now. And what I mean there is just you think about a ladder versus a web. You know, a ladder is a hierarchy, and that's vertical leadership. You stand at the top and you command and control, and people supposedly do what you say. And then horizontal leadership is being at the center of a web. And it's still a position of real power because you're at the center. All the information comes through you. You have all the connections. And indeed, I talk about leading from the center and the margin, which is one of the things I've had to learn how to do. But what I was talking about there was I would lecture about networks and how you lead from the center. And yet many people in my own organization definitely experienced me as being at the top of a hierarchy and being quite distant at the top of that hierarchy. Now, again, and you're a leader as well, I've never been able to lead without some hierarchy. And my experience of leading by consensus is that it is the person who can sit there the longest or be the loudest who often wins. And that's not the way either. So I don't want to say there's no hierarchy, but I did come to learn how to remove that sense of hierarchy to allow people to be more equal, to talk freely. And if they couldn't talk freely to me, then talk to Tyra or Cecilia or others. And Tyra Mariani became my effectively co-CEO. I was still CEO, she was president and COO. She's now running Howard Schultz's Family Foundation. And she and I really were very different in many ways. But we shared the job, and many people would talk to her. She was African-American, so many people of color, particularly women of color, would talk to her in a way they would not talk to me. Cecilia Munoz was a vice president, but really Cecilia used to run the Domestic Policy Council for President Obama, so we could all be working for her. And with two other members of our leadership group, it became a much more collective process. And that process allowed those folks to be the center of their own webs. And again, people are making decisions about what other people make or how they're being promoted. But we were trying and are still to create a culture where there's genuine participation. And I certainly am actively sharing power. And I think I'm a much better leader for sharing power. It's a little scary to start. You sort of feel like you've just sidelined yourself, which is an interesting use of the words. But it's been deeply rewarding, and I've continued it. I have a new president, Paul Butler, and he's the president and chief transformation officer.
So it sounds like some of the principles that you're talking about here are often principles that we can also think about when it comes to feminist leadership. Mm-hmm. Think about power sharing, when we're thinking about bringing others into decision-making spaces, active listening, things of that nature. How has in this journey, particularly from 2017 to 2021, so this 4-year journey for you, how has it shaped your thinking for yourself around feminist leadership?
So I do think women often find it easier to lead this way, but not always for good reasons. I mean, partly because we've been socialized to be too modest in various ways, right? We're too self-effacing, and it's always, if you think about women doing the housework in the office or women taking notes, all those sorts of things. So I'm definitely a little torn there, and I say at various points in the books that some of the criticism that came at me, I would have to ask myself, would that be the same toward a man? And my answer was often no. But then I also know superb women leaders who manage to blend this kind of more horizontal, participatory, collaborative approach with being plenty tough and plenty decisive when they need to be. And I also know men who I think model this more self-effacing style of leadership. And I would include David Bradley there, who gave me that advice, but others as well, people in New America, but others that I know. So I don't think it's as simple as women lead this way and men lead that way. And I think we are all still deeply the products and sometimes the victims of socialization. But I would say these are good leadership principles, period. And it may be harder for some of us to put them into practice than others, but at the very least, they're the right leadership principles for right now.
Well, I have young kids, so as you were talking about leadership and leading from the center versus those, I was picturing the whole time in my head, this is completely inappropriate, a game of shoots and ladders. We're falling down, we're trying to go up, we're trying to take a longer route, but we'll get there and not fall down that ladder. Anyway, so.
Exactly. And there's times you just have to say, because I said so, when they say why, and there's times you have to say, go to bed, and that's that. We're not going to reason about it.
I think part of this also is just, it is context specific sometimes in terms of what the situation needs, where you need to be, how you need to show up, and how you can make sure that either you can use your voice or give space to others to use their voices, which is not always easy, as we both know. So, all right. So now we're going to get to, I'm going to go to the heart. These were all the easy warm-up questions, Emery. Now I'm going to go to chapter 5, because chapter 5 for me was something that I actually think is the heart of every single conversation taking place today around what we are facing as a country. And chapter 5 in your book is around sharing power. Now, you talk about the social compact at New America. You give some examples of that, but you say ultimately that shared power is about demanding greater accountability. It's about distributive power from the ground up. And you write, quote, systems change requires systems leadership, a kind of collective leadership that is much more horizontal than vertical. And as I read this, I thought to myself, yes, absolutely. And yet we are so far from actually seeing most of what you wrote in how most organizations are actually run, at least those in my experience across the spaces that I have been in. And it is very hard culturally for us to move there as a collective. So I wanted to probe a little bit more. You share your own journey with this. How do you see this taking place at a more collective level, this concept of sharing power? Because it's frankly very threatening, I think, to an individual really to give up his or her own power benevolently or by force, depending on the situation, to let others in unless they're getting something for it. That's why in most cases you don't see that shared power and you see people climbing up to the corporate ladder for themselves. So I'd love to probe a little bit on on how you share power, not just you as a leader, but how we can share power and how we have to share power if we're going to change the we, and if we're going to create more spaces at the table for the rest of the country.
Yeah, well, that is the nub of it. And as I hear you ask that question, I'm sitting in Washington, so are you. If I look out my window, I could see the enormous bureaucracies lining Constitution Avenue with the secretary at the very top, and each floor is a lower rank. And they are so massive, these bureaucracies, and so hierarchical. And you think, how on earth are we going to change them? I guess I would say those bureaucracies were not there forever. They were built at the turn of the last century. We built most of them. We didn't have a civil service the way we do now, or a foreign service. So there is historical precedent for building things up and, of course, then tearing things down, the old spoil system. I think we're going to change because of the urgency of the moment. And I mean that in two ways. One, if you just think about the crises we've just been through or going through in Afghanistan and with Hurricane Ida right now, two kinds of immediate crises where just giving orders top to bottom just won't get the job done. You have to be more flexible. You have to create groups that are, as General McChrystal would say, you have a sort of shared consciousness but empowered execution. So everybody shares information, but you can act without constantly having to check, because you have to act fast and you have to adapt. And you just cannot wait from leadership from the top. So I think there's that kind of pressure. But again, the biggest question we face as a nation is, how do we share power? And here, when I say we, I mean the white, affluent, still largely male elite, which is still solidly in place. Chipped away at it, but you still, a couple of years ago, you had more CEOs named John in the top Fortune 500 than you had women. And of course, then you talk about women or men of color, and it's tiny numbers. That can't be. We cannot be in 2040 and really even in 2027, where by then Americans under 30, there will not be a white majority. We're not going to survive as a society that has anything to do with our ideals of equality, of justice, of fairness, but also in terms of tapping our talent, unless we can share power. Because, and what that means, and I agree that I think it's frightening, that's why I wanted to raise it. You've got to either step down or move over. And it's that simple. And of those two, it strikes me that moving over is much more palatable to most people, right? And they're not going to give up their job, but they can share it. And there are all sorts of ways that we can share power. And one example you and I would both know is job shares when you have a child. Whether man or female, right? So for a while you share a job. You can take positions where you have a person and a deputy, and you can make those two shared directors. And they can then share that job rather than one of them giving orders to another. And you don't even have to pay that much more money because they're already making a lot. There are countless opportunities to make room. And I think as the demands of young people who want us to live up to our ideals as a country, but also want, frankly, many of them, their opportunity to shine. This is the easiest way, but it's still tough. And I think most people are perfectly willing to talk a great diversity, equity, and inclusion game until it comes to giving up power. And I think you just have to grab that nettle.
So there's a question in the chat around this, and it echoes actually what my next question was. So I'm going to combine them actually. And you're writing from a position of authority, from leadership, of privilege. If you were in the other shoes, and you can define other here in lots of different ways. In the chat, someone asks if you are on the youth side, reaching out to elder leadership about needs and expectations from leaders and power sharing, but it could also be from those of the other, right? Those not at the center, but on the margins. If you were in their shoes, how do you suggest those on the other reach out, whether that's the edge, the margins, youth, minorities? How do you suggest they reach out? And my question on top of that is, do they have to wait for those in power to decide to share?
I don't think they will wait. And I think what you are seeing is tremendous turbulence in many organizations. And one of the ways you see it is corporations, but also nonprofits having real trouble holding on to talented staff, right? That there isn't enough room. And so people leave, and that's a real cost. But I think that agitation is right. Again, I saw it. I grew up more in the 70s and the 60s, but there was still the sort of results of the 60s where a lot of power structures did get shaken. And you're seeing that again today. So I think there should be plenty of preferably collective conversation and pushing from the margin or from lower down. But I'm also, frankly, using my position of power to issue a challenge to say, look, if we're serious, this is what it takes. And this is what I did. And I can point to a couple of other organizations I know who've done this, and to say, step down or move over, there's no other way. and then at least crack that open. I don't think somebody who is relatively junior can say to the CEO, you know what, I think you should share your job. But I think we can put it into the mainstream of conversation, and we can then have boards contemplate it, and we can have management groups contemplate it, and we can start saying, hey, look, why don't, instead of having a deputy, have you thought about sharing the job?
Somebody asks you, Anne-Marie, in the chat, have you had negative interactions with men in the workplace? Or can you talk a little bit more about those types of interactions and how you have dealt with gendered norms and expectations?
I've had plenty of negative experiences with men in the workplace, but also with women. And my top mentors were all men because there were no women. I'd never seen a woman teach a law class when I became a law professor. I'd never had a woman law professor. So my mentors were men who, respected and admired women and wanted to help younger women and did. It was so that I don't think of this in women versus male terms. I think men have been deeply socialized just as women have, and are often the prisoners of that socialization. I do think, and this is what I'd say about the whole conversation, this was a long journey for me. I couldn't have had this conversation in 2017, or even maybe by 2018, I was starting to get there. It's ongoing. So I don't think you can expect people to just immediately come to an understanding of how their own behavior is perceived. That goes back to being radically honest and trying to get people to talk to you honestly. I mean, how many times have you sat in a meeting where somebody is behaving very boorishly, whether as a man, as a white person, as a straight person, and you don't say anything, and then afterwards, when you're with your group, you're immediately going, God, did you believe that? We got to find ways that can be much more public. Not public, but honest and transparent. I don't even think 360 reviews get there. I think the person has to be, look, I really want to know what you heard. I need to change. And we should be giving, men, others, the chance. But otherwise, I give the same advice everybody gives to women about supporting one another and about standing up for ourselves and sitting at the tables, just as Sheryl Sandberg would say, and being assertive, but also really looking to others to help, as I think all of us, frankly, need.
So, part of what that strikes for me is how we take these types of experiences. And in the book, you do this, you pivot in chapter 6 as you move on to the remaining chapters around how you take that journey, those experiences that you've just shared with us, and think about, well, what does that mean as we think about applying that, both looking backwards, as you say, looking to the past, but looking to the future. And when we think about, let's start with the past, I guess, and then we can talk about where we are today and going to the future, but looking backwards first, right? You talk about this phrase, rugged interdependence, that comes up in different ways. And I really, that stuck out to me. And you talk about independence versus and with interdependence, and how the founding fathers, and I'm going to bungle your quote here, but how the founding fathers were so focused on independence while the founding mothers were focused on interdependence. And you talk about the lives, quote, we choose to remember. As you look back, and you share your own version of how you learned history, right? And your lens of history of what you were taught and what socialized with you, whether that was de Tocqueville or Emerson or Thoreau or Jane Addams, Hoover, Roosevelt, et cetera. And that might be, as you acknowledge, very different than how I read my history or others read their history. But as we look backwards as a nation and we think about renewal, as we look backwards, what are the things we're going to have to force ourselves to really grapple with, looking backwards, to think differently about, in order for us to get to that spirit of renewal?
Well, we are, as a country, going through a process of reckoning with our history. If you just think about the Confederate monuments right now, and I've just finished reading Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed, and in terms of really coming to grips with what slavery was, what it meant to enslave men, women, and children. And when we look at a plantation, that's not a place for holding weddings. That's a place where crimes against humanity were committed. And so we are going through that reckoning, and I think it's a very healthy process. What I was also saying, though, is that it's not as simple as just replacing one narrative with another. It's a both and in many cases. And the reason I used rugged interdependence was I was taking rugged individualism, which is definitely what I grew up with. This is the American mantra, and these stories of hardy pioneers, striking out across the country or in a wagon train, and all those kind of myths. And again, they're very male. You think of John Bunyan, Paul Bunyan rather, these various types. But then if you actually go back and read, and of course, if you read, I read a number of histories of wagon trains written by the women. And the women are not talking about independence. They're talking about depending on the other families in the wagon train and the neighbors and the communities where they landed. They're basically saying we would never make it without our families and our neighbors. So that's a different story. It doesn't mean that the first story is totally wrong. It means you put them together. So I talked about rugged interdependence. And that is true. Think about the white narrative of settling this country. It goes from east to west. If you're African American and you're telling the story of the 19th century, it's going to be a narrative from south to north with the Underground Railroad and emancipation more broadly. And it's going to be a narrative that is much more about solidarity than independence, because it's how a people came together to help one another, and again, with white people as well. So what I'm actually asking us to do is open our ears to many more stories and be willing to braid those together to get the richness of what I think our whole history is. That doesn't mean every strand is equal. And again, I think there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen, and reckoning and repair. But I also think part of that can be a joyful process as you listen to many more of those voices.
I every evening I don't always succeed, but I try to catch on the latest episode of Jeopardy. And I'm always thinking, as I'm watching the show, all of these, these facts of life, they're of a certain narrative and a certain nature. And if you know those facts, you are rewarded and you get the answer and you get the money and you move on, versus so much of that's not in that narrative, as an example of what we prize as knowledge in this society. And I think about that every single night, actually, as I watch Jeopardy, because I think, I don't know that, but wow, I know all this other stuff. I wish they would ask me this other stuff, and to me, what you're saying really is going to take us as an entire society and a country to rethink everything, our curriculum, our education system, who gets to decide what we learn.
Exactly.
Who gets to make that decision? And to fundamentally rethink it, which even in the Asian American context, with all the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans, is a big conversation here in Massachusetts, for instance, right now. There's no Asian American history in the curriculum, largely in the state right now, even though it's such a critical piece. And so rethinking all of that. So let's move a little bit more toward the present, and I'm going to marry this to one of the questions in the chat. So, as you think about looking backwards to look forwards, we're also right in the middle today of the present. A lot going on in the country, and without having, I'll let you decide how far you want to opine on politics of the moment, but there's a lot, whether it's voting rights changes at state levels going on right now, new abortion laws in Texas, which is what the question was in the chat. There's so much happening right now, particularly at the state level, to rewrite the character of this country. How do we think about your promise of renewal in that context, when it feels so heavy and hard, a lot of these changes for so many of us and what we're carrying?
So I don't have, the magic answer to division and polarization. I think it is not surprising we are going through it, because, as I said, we are going through an extraordinary demographic change. No modern democracy, anyway, has gone through this kind of change where a majority group who had been a majority group for hundreds of years is no longer a majority. And when I'm in Europe, Europe is far more diverse than it ever was before, and many Europeans are staunchly anti-immigrant as a result. They're talking about 20% of their population at most might be of color. The United States is really changing. That us, as you say, your family's history is just as much a part of American history as my family's history and the stories that have been told. So that creates a massive sense of cultural dislocation. And there's dramatic technological change at the same time. So people are losing jobs, they're not sure. And of course, we've got climate change. People respond to that with fear and hatred, and it's manipulated politically. And really the answer to that question is we have to change our political system. So in my view, we have ranked choice voting, which unfortunately Massachusetts just voted down, but they're going to have another chance. We have it in Maine and Alaska and many cities. But we actually have to have a political system where more of us can make ourselves heard in ways that would allow us, frankly, to have more than two parties so that we can govern ourselves as a far more diverse country. Because right now we've got two parties and a primary system that absolutely privileges the extremes. And you see the results. You see the results in state legislatures and in Congress. That's a long-term agenda, but it is one that we've changed our system before. In the 19th century, we elected senators through state legislatures, and then we changed it. Women got the vote. We finally got civil rights laws passed. Now those are being rolled back, but there's going to be a massive push to register everyone we possibly can in many of those states. What I'm not saying we shouldn't fight those fights, depending where you are. But I am saying we need as a country to be able to look forward to a positive vision of who we can be and what we can achieve. And I think there is a patriotism there. It's a critical patriotism. James Baldwin said, "I love my country so much that I reserve the right to criticize her perpetually." But it's still we need a vision, multiple visions of being a country that can reflect and connect the world, that can really do great things, whether that's fighting climate change, overhauling our economy. There's so many things we can do. And so I'm trying to get people to lift up their sights from the present fight and imagine in 2026, on the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, who can we be?
Well, I love in your coda at the end of the book that you give some very specific examples of who we could be. Yeah. And optimism and hope. And that's one of the questions in the chat that I want to ask you about, is around what gives you the most sense of optimism and hope. Then you give examples like 26 states using ranked voting, 26 states adopting the Social Progress Index, passage of the Family Security Act, and other examples. So we're in 2021, and it's almost over. That gives us 4 years and some change to get to this hopeful, optimistic vision. Oh, I think you end the coda with a female president in there, if I remember that.
That was before Biden said he was going to run again. I'm not going to call it, but I would like to see a female president sooner rather than later.
From here to there in 2026, and on that journey to the question in the chat, what gives you the most hope?
What gives me hope is looking at what's happening at the local level in many communities across the country. James and Deborah Fallows wrote the book Our Towns a couple years ago of what they found driving cross country. Often, if you really do focus on local news, you get lots of experimentation. You get experimentation around education, around childcare. You need federal legislation, I believe that, but there's an awful lot that is happening that is positive and that can point the way to different federal legislation. Indeed, the way Massachusetts had universal health care before Obamacare and as improving. So that gives me optimism. But what really gives me optimism is the way I see the richness of the country. and the way change can happen. I've been watching the US Open because I love to play tennis, and it was Labor Day weekend. And first it was Venus and Serena Williams, right? These two extraordinary African-American women who broke open tennis. I mean, Arthur Ashe did originally, but in our generation, it's the Williams sisters. And suddenly I'm watching the US Open, and there's one African-American woman or man after another, and other tennis players from other groups who are coming. And you look at that, and then you see all the players from all over the rest of the world. And you think, this is our country. Like we do attract people from everywhere, and we have all that talent. And the younger generation, race is still very much there, and prejudice is there, and bias, but it's very different than it was when I was growing up. And there's a sense of the richness and the potential of braiding those cultures together. And again, accepting this is who we are, rather than we are this, white, traditional, male, Protestant country, and we're just going to man the barricades and try to hold back cultural change. We can't. The only question is whether we embrace it and help it, or whether we just have to fight these fights until it comes anyway.
So in that spirit of both optimism, hope, but also a roadmap, right? For there, how do you, and for each person, the journey is going to be very different, and you acknowledge that in your book, and I want to acknowledge that in this conversation. So we're not saying that we're all going to have the same journey, but a lot of people right now are just burned out. They're exhausted. They're tired. Reading the news just is depressing. You wake up, and you're already depressed as you start your day. We're dealing with a global pandemic. Someone asks in the chat, whole new work life because of it. How do we kind of renew ourselves, actually, to give ourselves the energy, the courage, the passion, the drive to just get through not just our day-to-day, but to contribute collectively to the type of society that you are envisioning and that so many of us are fighting for every single day?
Well, I've certainly had plenty of very dark days, and I write about them, and they'll come again. I don't have any doubt. But that's, again, why I told this story the way I told it, which was a period of crisis. And I do feel that we're in crisis now. And then the exhaustion, I often avoid the news, and I often feel like, we've got a sword of Damocles over our head, just this pervasive uncertainty. But that is where I think showing that you can make change in your own life, however small that might be. And this is not, I talk about transformation in the large, but it's actually a much smaller process of change. Listening to your spouse when you hear that criticism, right? And not immediately pushing back, and actually thinking, maybe there's something in that, or asking for that kind of feedback at work in a way that says, look, really tell me what you think, because I need to hear it so that I can grow. That's a muscle, and it's a muscle that we can practice. And when we practice it, it becomes easier to actually make those changes. So that's, again, where as an individual, as a leader, I'm trying to show that it's not so hard. You got to steel yourself, but it becomes a reflexive practice. And then I think that's where hope and confidence start to come back, because we start to think, okay, I can change. I'm making little changes, then bigger changes, and I can change the way I interact with others. And then again, the next step is feeling like you're part of a larger group. And that's important for us. And we've been so isolated. And then thinking about, well, what change can we make? And again, I'm not asking for huge. It might be something quite small. And it might be actually taking some time for yourself if you don't do that, because that's just as important. But I came through it, and many people have come through so much worse. I'm trying to give people a sense of what a process of renewal is. And renewal is perpetual, right? Just like the year renews, just like life renews. So it is not something you do once and it's over, but it is, again, it's a way of looking back to give yourself the strength and confidence to really believe you can build something new.
Well, Anne-Marie, I met you, you're not going to remember this, but I met you 17 years ago when I started as a graduate student at Princeton, and you were dean of the school then. And you had such a huge impact on so many of us, myself obviously included, because we're having this conversation today, 17 years later. But I just want to say that as we think about, you look exactly the same. As we think about, your closing words here around where we can be and where we can go individually, but collectively as well. I think, I just want to say, I want to thank you for your courage in putting it out there and putting your story out there. It's not, as someone who's been in the process of writing my own book lately for my first, not like you, but my first book, it's very vulnerable to put yourself out there like you have. I do hope that many people who are out there feel inspired to also know that there are days where you are up and down and sideways, and that yet you can pick yourself up together collectively and keep fighting the good fight, because that's what it does take. And that you have demonstrated that with your own journey that you've shared with us in Renewal, and that you've also shown many of us personally in our own careers as well. And I just want to honor that. So thank you so much for having this conversation with all of us tonight with the Harvard Bookstore. I really enjoyed reading the book. I can't recommend it enough to all of you out there, and hope that you can also spread the word as something that can give us a sense of individual and collective renewal as we move forward. Thanks for having this conversation with us tonight. And Audrey,
Fatema, thank you. And since you're not going to do it, I'm going to plug your book, The Development Diplomat, which is a fabulous book about how to bring together the work of development and diplomacy, which frankly, everybody interested in foreign policy in the United States needs right now. So
thank you so much. And Audrey, back over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much both for being here and taking this time out of your very busy schedules to come and give this fantastic talk. And thank you to everyone at home who's tuning in tonight and showing up for authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and the incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. Check out the chat if you would like to purchase a copy of Renewal. You won't regret it. Please remember to shop indie, shop local. From all of us at Harvard Bookstore, be well, and thank you again for your time. Take care, everybody.